Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The lottery in Indiana seems to be a sure bet, at least for this short session of the legislature, although there are more hurdles for it to jump after this year. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the prospect for legalized gambling in Indiana. We'll also talk about AIDS and Ryan White, the Kokomo schoolboy who was denied access to his school. What rights are involved with a sick student to attend a public school despite the fears of school officials and parents? Our panelists on Public Affairs Roundtable today are John Rouse, attorney with DeFer Varan, Hanley, Radcliffe, and Reed in Muncie; Steve Johnson from the Department of Sociology, Ball State University; and John Rouse from Ball State's Department of Political Science. John Rouse, let's talk first about the Ryan White case. Do we have a clash of rights here of a student to attend a public school and, I guess, elected school officials to do what they think is right, perhaps in protecting the health of all the other students?
Well, we have that kind of a clash, but from a legal standpoint, there may not be a clash of rights in the sense that the Ryan White case has, as it's unfolded, has permitted Ryan to continue in school. And for those people that haven't followed the case closely, perhaps I should give a little background on it. Ryan he's a 14-year-old hemophiliac who contracted AIDS from a blood transfusion. And he's a student in the Western School Corporation near Kokomo, and the school corporation last fall determined to exclude him from school because of a concern about the possibility that he might infect other students. The position of the school administrators was supported by the teachers and by the school board, and also by the parents and the community. The Indiana Civil Liberties Union became involved in the case and filed suit in federal court asking for an injunction to allow Ryan back in school. The federal court dismissed that case because there are administrative procedures in Indiana whereby a student can be excluded only after a hearing. This hearing was then held before the school corporation administrators, and the administration determined after that hearing that Ryan should be excluded. There is then an appeal from that decision by the school corporation to the Indiana Board of Education. The Indiana Board of Education held a hearing on the appeal and determined that the Western School Corporation was wrong in excluding Ryan and ordered him to be admitted back into school pending the certification by the county health officer in Howard County that he was in fact fit to return to school. The standard that was applied in this situation is set out in the statute, and it states that a student may be excluded from a school corporation if he or she has a dangerous communicable disease which is transmittable through normal school contacts that poses a substantial threat to the health and safety of the school community. The medical evidence as it exists at this time would indicate that AIDS is not a disease which can be transmitted through casual contact. And for that reason, the county medical officer determined that Ryan did not pose a threat to the other students or to the teachers in the school corporation, and that he should be readmitted, particularly since his own health apparently was adequate. Now, the school was adequate to allow him to attend. Now, the school corporation has 30 days to appeal the decision of the Indiana State Board of Education to the courts. There's no indication yet that the school corporation intends to do so, although recent news reports would indicate that the school corporation is unhappy with that decision. And there have been, for example, comments by the head of the school board to the effect that the county medical officer will be liable and responsible in the event that anyone else contracts the disease. And the same individual indicated that the state health commissioner should resign and that he handled the case improperly. On the other hand, as I indicated previously, the guidelines that have previously been issued by the Indiana State Board of Health and all current medical knowledge would indicate that the State Board of Health and the State Board of Education acted properly in this case.
This was a decision made on medical evidence. I mean, there's a procedural flaw involved in excluding from school originally, but basically it got down to, well, we really don't care what your fears are as school board members, as parents. The medical evidence doesn't support it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The circumstance as it arose where Ryan was excluded was based as much as anything else on I think a completely understandable fear that Ryan could transmit the AIDS disease to other individuals, and considering the fact that it is an invariably fatal disease, you can understand how other parents would be concerned about the possibility of this arising.
John, if I could jump in here, the thing you've done today is to tell us about the legal concerns, and I think that most citizens forget that we are a legal society. Also, you've introduced the factors of medical evidence, and also, and I should say that for the most part, most of us don't understand the technicalities of the medical kinds of concerns. I think the real concerns that most Indiana citizens have, and of course most Americans, is the issue of politics, and of course most of us don't take a lot of time to think about, well, what are the medical ramifications, what are the legal concerns, because we don't know anything about that. But we are concerned about the politics, and we are concerned about our families and our children and so forth. Doesn't it come down to the issue of fear versus reason? And maybe in this situation, the courts and the legal system has decided on the behalf of reason and education?
I think that's right, and I think that's one of the roles of the court system, to sometimes in our country the rights of the minority need to be protected, particularly when there's an overwhelming majority who believe that the rights of that individual should give way to the rights of the majority. And part of our system of checks and balances provide that the courts give this opportunity to protect the rights of individuals. In this case, certainly if the medical evidence would show that there is a risk of harm to other students and to others in the school community, then the result would have been different.
Yeah, now hasn't the head of the State Board of Health set up certain kinds of guidelines in this regard?
Last summer, the State Board of Health did issue guidelines on dealing with AIDS victims and AIDS carriers, and I'm not really an expert on those guidelines, but it's my understanding that they do represent the current state of medical evidence. There was a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine that reported on a study of the families of AIDS victims that showed that no family member of an AIDS victim has ever contracted the disease, even though the family members have shared towels and drinking glasses and toilet facilities. And by the same token, doctors and nurses who have treated AIDS victims have not contracted the disease.
I might make a comment here. It seems to be one of the reasons why there is so much fear and anxiety concerning AIDS, because it is new and people don't know. And there have been experts on various programs, like I read somewhere on the CBS morning show, national television show, that there were two so-called experts which were on. One said that AIDS cannot be transmitted through casual contact. Another one said that there is some evidence that it might be contacted. So it seems to me there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety out there because the medical community hasn't come down 100%. There all seems to be some qualifiers here and there. Well, the question I might have of you, John, is are there any other attempts within the community to try to reduce this anxiety among the parents that would be sending, especially the parents that would be sending their kids to the school with Ryan White?
In the Western school system, there are efforts being made, first of all, by the county health officials to meet with the teachers and the administration to explain what's known at this time about the disease. And then, as I understand it, there's a meeting of the parents tonight to explain more about this to them before Ryan actually goes back to school, I think at the end of this week. I think they're using this week also to explain to the other students more about this. And what it boils down to is that education is the answer or the best way to deal with fear.
Steve points out that this is a relatively new disease. We don't know everything about it that we might know 10 years from now. Certainly it can be transmitted through blood, through semen, certain bodily fluids. They don't think so through tears, through saliva, but perhaps so. Is the state health commissioner and the health officer in Howard County, are these people assuming some liability if in fact some student does contract AIDS from Ryan White in whatever method?
Not in my opinion, as long as they act in a reasonable manner consistent with current medical knowledge. And they have certain discretionary roles to play, and in exercising that discretion, as long as they don't abuse the discretion and make a decision that contradicts current medical evidence in a case like this, then they won't have any liability.
Okay.
There seems to be a lot of passing the buck in this case. You know, the school board seems to be greatly concerned about, you know, who's going to be liable in case someone does contact AIDS as a result of, you know, the Ryan White case. Seems to be a lot of passing the buck. Now they're blaming the state commissioner, you know, for they didn't provide him with the appropriate facts and such. Seems to be a lot of that going on.
But you mentioned the key word of passing the bucks, and this is passing the dollars. And so, I mean, that is a big concern in terms of being liable, is it not?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's right, and I think I feel certain that the State Board of Education, State Board of Health, and the county medical officer did obtain some legal advice before rendering the decisions that they rendered, because I'm sure they were concerned about the liability aspects. Now, this really isn't a black and white issue, because there are cases, as I understand it, where a student should be excluded if the student has AIDS according to current medical knowledge. For example, if the student has open sores, or if the student is prone to biting, or if the student himself or herself happens to be ill at the time or in a weakened condition, so that he might contract diseases more easily because of having AIDS, then in those cases the student should be excluded. But if, based upon all the evidence and the medical evidence in a particular case, there's no risk to other students or to that student, then the county medical officer probably had no real choice, given the standard that applies under the state statute.
Let's move now to an issue with which the legislature is dealing with some reasonable care, that being of the lottery. The legislature appears on the verge of approving the lottery resolution in this short session, Steve Johnson, but it's still far from being resolved. Is that not correct?
Well, if I was to make a bet about whether or not the lottery would pass, I would say indeed it's going to. Speaker Daley just pointed out that he thought it was an excellent chance it will be passing the House, which will take place shortly. But that won't be the end of it. I might explain a little bit more about the process that it needs to go through. That is, and either if indeed it does pass the legislature, which looks like it's going to in 1986, it also has to be it has to be passed by another state legislative session, either in 1987 or 88. Evidently, if it doesn't pass in 87, it has another chance in 88. So let's say it passes in 1987, then it has to go to a statewide referendum where we Hoosiers either voted up or down. After that, it still isn't through. The state legislature then will have to pass laws about which particular types of gambling are going to be considered legal. Lotteries, of course, everybody's thinking lottery now. But another very important aspect of this bill, and one which brought it about to begin with, is the benefits for the horse race industry in the state. There's a lot of good farms in this particular state that produce a lot of good what they call standard breds, that is trotters and pacer horses. And that industry is very lucrative. It could be very lucrative for the state of Indiana, bring about a large sum of money for the industry, and also that money is taxed at the pari-mutuel window in the racetracks that would probably be developed here. So that you've got that particular aspect as well.
The legislature in the late 70s did pass a pari-mutuel law that was struck down by the Indiana Supreme Court on the basis that it was a lottery and therefore unconstitutional.
That is exactly why they're engaging in this little process right now. It's the Indiana State Supreme Court said that pari-mutuel betting violates the constitutional amendment against lotteries in the state of Indiana. So now what we're doing now, and the reason it takes so long is because we're changing the Indiana state constitution. And what we're doing essentially is repealing that law, just like the repeal of prohibition. And now we're repealing this lottery law so that so the state legislature can proceed to pass laws which deal with which particular types of betting will be legalized.
Why are we doing this? Is it because people like to gamble, or is it because the state needs the money?
I think that is the key reason. People in this state, the polls have been taken, that people in the state want to be able to gamble on the lottery. That's why it's passing. This particular point of view has been gotten across to their particular representatives in the state legislature. In fact, a representative here in Muncie said that he is personally against it, but he finds out that his constituents want it, so that's why he voted for it. I think the major reason in a democracy, that's the way things are supposed to work, aren't they? That people in the state want the lottery, and as a result of that, their elected representatives are more than likely going to pass that particular law. I might just make one more point, John, before you ask a question.
Before you pass the ball here.
There, pass the ball. Not the buck, but the ball. Another reason is, I think that people like the lottery, is that for the most part their lives are rather humdrum and dull. You know, we get up in the morning, you get 5 square meals a day, you go to work, you watch a little television, you go to bed. I think people like a little risk-taking in their life. You know, and this provides a little bit of that, not much. Hopefully, and it won't provide much. That is, we won't have any chronic gamblers. But, you know, people want to try to put a little bob or two down, and I've been known to do that myself in the past, you know, to try to take a little risk to see if you can win a little more dough. And in this case, you know, the benefits, even though the odds are quite low, the benefits are great. So I think that's to look at it from a social psychological point of view, which this is what I am. I'm a social psychologist. I think that the reason people like the lottery is that they enjoy this little risk-taking from time to time. It serves a function for them.
Yeah, you know, I won't disagree with those kinds of things, but it's much deeper than that. Really, the people of Indiana are reluctant to raise taxes. And when Graham-Rudman comes into being and we lose federal funding, we're going to have money coming from somewhere. But in terms of looking at this lottery, in terms of what the expectations are, the expected net revenue is between $100 and $190 million. This is going to be less than other states because of our rural backgrounding or our rural population. So the lottery does have a economy of scale kind of concern. So we would expect to get less money from a lottery in Indiana as opposed to Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. Now, as I mentioned, those 3 states, the estimate or the rough estimate is that Hoosiers are spending about $126 million a year in the lotteries in those other states. But in terms of where the money goes, it's broken down something like that. 50% of the money collected from the lottery will go to the prizes. 7% will go to administration of the lottery in terms of promoting the lottery and that kind of thing. The other 43% of the money collected will go to whatever the legislature decides that it should go to. 3 concerns in this state so far will be mental health, education, and cities and towns. And the cities and towns runs into the issue of Graham-Rudman and less money available. Now, if you ask those people who are opposed to the lottery, are you willing to raise taxes? I think that's one of the key questions.
Well, that is probably the second basic reason, John, that for why politicians in particular want to see the lottery pass, that it is going to provide some revenue. The opponents say that it's not going to provide that much, but you could argue that something is better than nothing. You know, it'll provide something, especially us in education would like to see it pass because some of that money will go towards education.
But Steve, isn't the issue one of morality and morals? And why should we follow everybody else if this kind of issue is not right for society?
Well, okay. Society has a lot of vested interests. One of them happens to be, let's say, the interests of Christian fundamentalists. And some of the people that were down in Indianapolis that are fighting against the bill are Greg Dixon, a number of people, the moral majority. And there's a lot of, true believing, deep religious fundamentalists in the state that just think that this is wrong, that it's not consistent with their traditional values. And it seems to me we have to consider them. Now they become the minority. There were some amendments I heard that there was an attempt to pass that said that the state should not be advertising this. And I think maybe there might be some merit to that. I mean, why, if we have a lottery, let's not try to wear it on our sleeves. Let's try to reduce probably the advertising, make a big game out of it. I'm sure that I've heard about game shows that are involved in the lotteries. Maybe we could kind of subdue this type of thing. People want to bet on the lottery, but let's not make it such a big deal that that we're going to cause a lot of anguish for religious fundamentalists. And these are important people in this state.
Well, religious fundamentalists aren't the only opponents to this law. There are people who in fact say that when you have a lottery, have legalized gambling in the state, you increase your welfare costs, your poor relief costs, and certainly we're in a poor relief crunch in Indiana already, and welfare costs continue to go up, particularly hospitalization of indigents. We're getting into trouble in that area. But as people who can least afford to spend money on gambling, legalized gambling, will do that. And when Doc Bowen vetoed the parimutuel law before the legislature overrode him back in the 70s, he said he was told under no uncertain terms by J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, that when you bring in legalized gambling, you also invite into your society an element of organized crime that wants to get a piece of the easy pie, and therefore you also increase crime and you also increase the cost of having to enforce the law.
Well, indeed, there is evidence that organized crime does become involved in states when indeed gambling is legalized. But there are a number of states that have lotteries now, and I don't know if organized crime is going to particularly focus in on Indiana. My argument also would be in terms of people that would kind of waste their money, the people who can least afford it. I would probably argue that these people will probably be irresponsible with their money in other ways as well. This is one way in which they can waste their money, but I would say the very same person who is the chronic gambler, which is always a concern, is probably also someone who will probably buy appliances that they can't afford or buy a car that they can't afford. So I don't know necessarily this is going to increase the welfare rolls or people as a result of throwing away their money. Of course, that's an empirical fact. We'll find out.
You're saying basically that because the people want it, because they want it for recreation and leisure, regardless of the cost, we ought to go ahead and do it?
Yeah, well, Andy Rooney made a point on 60 Minutes this last Sunday that you probably should print the names of the losers as well as the winners. I mean, there should be some attempt to try to eliminate this chronic gambling problem. So that's one thing that you could do.
Steve, I have mixed feelings about lotteries, but isn't there something to be said for repealing an amendment which is inconsistent with the realities of current society? We have, occasionally we have what some people consider to be overzealous prosecutors breaking up bingo games in the churches, which are quite common, and we have drawings for charitable causes which are technically illegal because they're lotteries, and any number of instances I think you could point to that are really more or less allowed to occur even though they might be illegal under Indiana law.
Well, the argument with a lot of things that are illegal that are engaged in now is the way that you can control these is to legalize them. Like the example has been made of prostitution, for example, that indeed that's illegal. The way we can control it better is if we legalize it. Well, there's a lot of problems with that as well. But again, it just gets back to the problem that we are a democracy, and there's lots of interests. There are conservative fundamentalists that think the lottery is wrong. There are other people that think it's okay. And I think what's happening here is that in any good democratic process, those people who would like to see the lottery are winning out.
Steve, but I think it's more than that. We have to ask the question, as our legislature makes this decision, as the people make the decision, is it good public policy? And I think there's no clear indication as it may be good pragmatic public policy, but if those people out there who are really opposed to the lottery, ask yourselves, are you willing to raise taxes? You don't have to have the lottery. Now, on the horse racing thing, this state will not gain a penny in terms of the estimate is in terms of horse racing, if that is passed, parimutuel betting, that it'll raise about $10 million, which is almost nothing. So the only issue is an economy of scale lottery in terms of how much it's going to raise because of our rural background. In other words, a lot of people who come from a rural background as Indiana is a rural state, are not going to bet.
But then pari-mutuel betting also increases, a matter of fact, it creates a new industry in your state. Not only does it improve that climate for horse breeders, it attracts people, it creates tracks. I think Indiana could support 3 or 4 tracks, employees at those tracks who pay taxes on their income. It's not like it raises only $10 million in taxes. There are also other incomes involved with that sort of industry.
Yeah,
And also you just simply benefit, there's large numbers of people that go to Kentucky, Ohio, and Illinois to bet on the races. And those people will stay now in Indiana. So you've got the support of this industry, which will come from that influx as well.
Is there a chance that the federal government will get into the lottery business if they see that it's a great revenue producer?
No, not with Ronald Reagan as president.
Well, that's
He
been
doesn't like to see
suggested
any kind
that
of federal
perhaps we have a national
programs.
lottery to help erase the deficit. It's enormously popular, and
That's right.
could you imagine the income from a national lottery? What sort of payoff you could promise?
Well, Reagan doesn't want to raise taxes. Maybe he'll be for a
That's
lottery.
maybe I might be convinced by this.
So what we're going to do is the legislature is probably going to take the easy way out. That is, we don't want to bite the bullet and raise taxes, so we'll have a hidden tax in form of we'll tax their recreation. Their recreation will be legalized gambling. And on the other hand, we'll stop the drain of Indiana dollars into the Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois
It
lottery.
seems to me that's a benefit. This money that is presently going to the other states, and the horse players that will stay in the state, is going to be a benefit. That'll be much. It's just like bringing the Indianapolis Colts into Indiana. We now have a professional football team in which people will,
let's
rather
not get
than
on
going to the
Colts,
Cincinnati Bengals.
But the lottery,
Colts aren't a sure bet
Steve,
by any means.
That's right. In one sense, yes.
is essentially a regressive tax. And it's not progressive in terms of hitting everybody at the same kind of level. It's a regressive tax.
Now, I would say that money that stays in the state, Illinois gets that regressive tax now. Indiana now will at least get some tax as a result of this.
But in fact, it's not based on the ability to pay. It's based on whoever can come up with $2 or $5, and if your kid has to do without shoes so you can buy lottery tickets, that's what happens. Isn't that the way it works?
True. In that sense, it is a regressive tax. But
Aren't
again,
you-
it's a regressive tax that Indiana will get rather than Indiana.
Aren't
rather
you,
than Illinois.
aren't you also assuming, though, that right now everyone who wants to play the lottery is going to another state to play the lottery? The other possibility is
there's
that
an estimate about $25 million a year is going to lotteries in other states. So
No,
at least that-
$126 million is going to the lotteries in other states.
Okay, we have a disagreement on that.
Well, we're going to have plenty of time to think
It's a
about
lot
that.
of dough.
The best we can do at this point is the legislature passes it this year, passes it again in 87 or 88, and then it goes onto
It goes to the people.
ballot in 88 in November, and then maybe in the legislature of 89 they can enact enabling legislation. Well,
Correct.
we're out of time. Given that, wait till 88. Thanks to our panelists Steve Johnson, John Mull, and John Rouse for being with us today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse.